All right. My name is Chris Campbell. I'm a CPA and I work with small businesses and individuals to help them pay the least amount of taxes possible while keeping them out of jail. So today I wanted to touch a little bit on the announcement that came through from National Association of Realtors. I had done a piece before where, and this was probably about 7, 8 months ago, but I was talking about my experience recently with selling a property that I had. I raised the question about why I actually had to pay the buyer's agent. I was questioning why I had to pay the buyer's agent because it didn't really make sense to me. And lo and behold, caught quite a bit of traction on one of the platforms that I had posted it on and got a lot of feedback, some flack from some realtors that stated that the compensation structure just didn't really make sense to me, that I have to pay a buyer's agent, but they don't represent my interest. They represent their buyer's interest, yet their fee comes out of my proceeds ultimately. That was the premise and how it just didn't quite add up. But since then, quite a bit has happened where the National Association of Realtors faced a bunch of lawsuits essentially regarding this exact issue, where they were facing a bunch of lawsuits and a number of people felt the same way. I actually recorded that well before the lawsuits and any judgments were made. But since then, there have been a number of lawsuits. And as of recent, the NAR decided to settle and change their practices. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that settlement, but also what I think the impact is going to have on the industry, since my last take seemed to be pretty controversial. I didn't think so. I just thought it made sense, made common sense, and looks like a bunch of other people agreed with. From the way I understand it, there's going to be changes going forward. One being that the buyer will now have to sign a compensation agreement with their buyer's agent. So no longer will the fees that a buyer's agent makes have to come from the listing agent. So a buyer will now have to compensate the buyer's agent on their own. That's one of the biggest takeaways. I think the other large takeaway is that on the MLS, the multiple listing services, where the agents and the realtors access, or the realtors access different listings, the listings can no longer include what a listing agent is going to pay a buyer's agent for bringing or representing a buyer, which I think is big and also well overdue, because it was the dirty little secret or horribly kept secret amongst realtors where you're not supposed to do that. But we all know it was a practice that was done. Buyer's agents would steer their clients to homes that they know were paying higher commission, or if the commission was too low, buyer's agents wouldn't even bother mentioning it, even though it could be a home that fit the buyer's needs. But because the buyer's agent wasn't getting paid enough, they just wouldn't bother mentioning it to him or showing it to him. So we all know that was happening. So hopefully the elimination of listing the buyer's agent's fees will eliminate that. I think that will force the buyer's agents to strike deals directly with the buyers. If they want that 2.5%, 3%, they're going to have to get it from the buyer. What do I think the effects on that will be? Some people think the transaction costs, or the cost to the seller, or the money that they have to pay out, because now they don't have to worry about paying a buyer's agent, that the seller's costs will go down. And as a result, prices will come down. I think another argument that I heard was, well, because buyers are going to have to pay their buyer's agent, the prices are going to come down because they're not going to have the money to pay both. Personally, I feel both of those sentiments are false. I think this will have zero bearing on the price of the homes. All it means is the seller gets to keep more money in their pocket. I don't see why a seller would then feel the need to reduce their price simply because the folks that are selling it don't get as much. I really don't see that happening because of that. And then also, folks are making the assumption that a buyer is actually willing to come out and pay 2.5%, 3% of an agent fee on top of what they have to pay for the home. Truth be told, I don't think buyers are going to be willing to pay an additional 2.5% to 3% of the sales price on top of what you have to come up with for simply buying a home. I really don't see that happening. So I think that there will be a fee that folks will be willing to pay buyer's agents. I just don't see it as being 2.5% to 3%. Yeah, I really don't see, for the most part, the value there to pay 2.5%, 3% when you have other folks that are involved in the transaction, such as a real estate attorney, whether it be a real estate attorney, whether it be your title folks, where they provide value to a transaction and they're making nowhere near this 2.5 to 3%. Truth be told, it inherently works. A buyer paying a buyer's agent a percentage of what they pay inherently doesn't make sense because it pits the buyer's agent and the buyer against each other. The buyer's compensation is directly tied to how much you pay. So the agent is incentivized for you to pay more, not less. Using that structure, every dollar they negotiate to reduce the price, they're reducing their commission. So where's the incentive for them to do that? I really don't see that flying on the buyer's agent side. I think sellers agents and you have your listings, I think they'll be perfectly fine. I think it actually might be a windfall for them because they may be able to get away with charging anywhere from 6 to 4%, knowing that they can actually keep the whole thing. So if you're a listing agent and you have a methodology of getting listings in the door, I believe it's a windfall for you. But buyer's agents, if your strategy was to go to sites like Zillow and Redfin, Zillow's business model is based upon lead generation for real estate agents. So you see a listing on Zillow and you see an agent there, and it's not even their listing, but they're a buyer's agent. So I think Zillow is going to be hurt by this because I think they probably get a majority of their folks that advertise for. I really don't see with the buyer's agents, they're just not going to pay. I just don't see people paying that 2 to 3%. Now, I still think they'll be compensated. I just don't think it'll be as much. If I was a consumer, I may not want to go into a purchase without any representation, but I think I'd be willing to pay, let's say, a flat fee, a couple grand to be represented. And then if there's any incentive, the incentive might be to see how much can you save me? How much can you cool off this price? So maybe I pay you a percentage of what you save me, not what the total price is. Savvy buyers may say, okay, I'm willing to pay $350,000 for this property. Anything you save below this $350,000, I will give you an extra percentage. So I'll give you 5% of what you're able to save. If it's $350 and you save me $5,000, then I'll give you 5% for $5,000. You save me $5,000, I'll pay you $500 for you saving me the $5,000. Thanks a lot. So compensation for listing agents, that model going that way. I also foresee more attorneys. I think this also creates a tremendous opportunity for attorneys that specialize in real estate to get into the representation game a little heavier than they are. They can simply say, hey, look, if you have attorneys that know the laws and know the things to look out for, I can see attorneys or consultants that are very knowledgeable about the real estate transaction process, where they can simply just say, hey, look, you go and find the home, go and work with the listing agent to go see the home, right? Because the listing agent is always going to be available to show the home or have someone show the home. So you go find the home, which also eliminates a buyer's agent from having to run around and show all these different properties. So I don't think you really need a buyer's agent to do that. For the most part, the information listings are readily available online. So unless you want someone to do the legwork for you, you may not even need to do that. You can do it on your own. You can get some sort of assistant or an agent that does provide that services, or even, again, if you have an attorney or a consultant that can direct you to listings. So you may not necessarily need an agent to do that. But what I foresee happening is that people can go and find listings on their own, go visit the listings through the listing agent. And then when ready to make an offer and go forward with that purchase, then you can bring in the consultant. So whether that be that listing agent or whether that be an attorney, whether that be some sort of consultant, I think this opens things up for folks beyond licensed realtors, because at the end of the day, you really just want someone familiar with the laws of a transaction and know what to look out for. A number of those things can be accomplished without being a licensed realtor or agent. At that point, for a buyer, you really just want guidance, making sure you have your interests looked out for with making that home purchase. I think it's really going to create some big opportunities for those listing agents that adapt and people that want to create a business model around this, whether that be consultants or lawyers, but folks that are knowledgeable. I really think this creates new opportunity. You're going to have a lot of folks that relied on getting leads to be buyer's agents. I think they're probably going to leave. You're going to have some of those agents leave the profession if they don't adapt. I think you'll have some that'll adapt, but a number that won't. because of the new compensation model that I think may happen where folks are more paying a consulting fee, which will be nowhere near the percentage of that 2-3% of the home. I don't think it'll be anywhere near that, especially in high cost areas. You have your brokerages. The brokers will now have a problem with their compensation model, right? Because with most brokers, they have agents that work under them. Those agents usually split the commissions that are generated with the brokers. Keep in mind that 3% actually has to get bust down between the agent and the broker that they work for. And those percentages vary. Sometimes it's 50-50, but if you're a greater agent, sometimes it's more in favor of the agent. Nonetheless, even that 3% gets broken down. So the agent doing the work may wind up with 1 to 1.5% that actually winds up in their pocket. And obviously that doesn't take into account any expenses that the agent has to incur, right? Marketing, travel, things of that nature. So given the current model, and as the fees become a lot less for the buyer's agent, the model for a broker now has to change because a broker really relies on each agent making transactions or closing deals. Now, the brokers don't necessarily pay the agents a salary, but there are costs that brokers incur for having agents on their roster. So it may not be salaries, but technology fees. I don't know all the ins and outs of brokers, but I believe some brokers charge their agents various fees for keeping that agent on. A broker does incur some fees simply by bringing people on. I would imagine that they would look for some sales to offset those costs, but maybe these brokers have it set up where they don't care if you're a non-performer. But I would imagine that if the fees are now lower, it may get more expensive, or the return on the investment having an agent online now becomes a lot more difficult to achieve because the returns aren't there if they're mainly a buyer's agent. So nonetheless, I think brokers will make it more expensive for agents to carry their license because that rate of return is going to get a little lower on the current. So I think the rates will be a bit higher that agents will have to pay their brokerages just to keep non-performing agents from being a burden. I think once it becomes more expensive for agents to be actively licensed, I think that's also going to push some people out because it will just simply be too expensive for them to maintain. I don't see brokerage houses carrying non-performing agents, especially when the fees get lower. So those are my predictions as far as what I think will happen with the industry. It's really a time where folks are just going to have to adapt. My last video that I caught a lot of flack on, a lot of agents were trying to explain why the current compensation system made sense. They weren't really explaining why it made sense. They were really just explaining the system. And I was trying to explain, like, look, I know the system. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not broken. So many agents are going to have to adapt. As they say, adapt or die. I'm glad the change is made. I'm glad folks are able to see things my way. The world changes, business evolves. Got to adapt or die. So that's my take on it. Hopefully it was helpful. That's all for now. If you have any more questions about this topic or any other tax accounting related questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help. All right. I'll see you in the next one.